No, it wasn't treated at all.
It should have been.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. We're getting set up here. Happy Sunday to you. I'm still dark from walking inside. We're running a little late, but hang with us just a minute, and we'll get going here. We've got here. You know what? For those of you at home, let me sort of show you what's going on here in the room. All right. You don't often get to see everyone who's here, so I'm going to do that. Gives you a little something to look at besides me, which is always good, it seems. I discovered every Sunday when I go pull these down to put them on YouTube, I've discovered the first thing you see if you're watching the video raw is either my backside or my stomach, and so I've got to try to improve my stage presence. Nancy here, yeah, I need some blocking assistance on this, I think. Yeah, okay. Woo, hello everyone. For those of you who are not Dallas, it is cold here for us, right?
We don't take cold very well.
And we don't take cold very well anymore. I mean, particularly when we were running the air conditioner on Christmas, right? Yeah. Because it was so hot.
And then the next day it was so cold.
And then cold. And yesterday, legitimately, we can say it snowed here.
Yeah.
I saw it.
Yeah, it flurries, but nothing like what the East Coast is getting right now. It has gotten. But oh my goodness, how about that?
Mark,
Yes, Ann.
speaking of weather, I got one of those nah experiences about 4 o'clock this morning. My landline rang, and it said, "This is Pinellas County, Florida weather reporting a tornado warning in your area." And I looked it up on Google, and they did have tornado warning.
Wow.
But they think you live in Pinellas County, Florida. Yeah, that's like yesterday before the snow started, I got a little alert on my phone from the weather channel saying, expect snow flurries. And they thought I was in the wrong place till I walked outside. Yeah, very, very crazy.
Holly was out and texted me, "It's snowing." I don't know what part of Dallas she was in, but
Yeah, well, I think it was snowing all over town.
It was flurries.
Yeah, we had flurries.
We got a few flurries in Garland.
Yeah, so, you know, that's enough. That's enough snow for us, right? Enough for us, I think, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, but as someone said to me yesterday, at least it's not February 2021
Yes.
with the great blackout. Right? At least it's not that for us. How's everybody doing today? Yeah, Lynette, glad to have you back with us. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. I was going to, y'all know I do sometimes what I call pickup funerals, and that's when a family doesn't have a minister or a relationship to a church. And I did one of those Friday that I'll tell you about at the end of the lesson, because the whole story doesn't need to be living on the internet.
You wrote about it.
Yeah, well, there's more. Oh, there's more. Yeah. Lynette, I was the only white person in the room. Well, no, not for me.
Only if you didn't know you were supposed to.
Right. I felt entirely inadequate for the task, because basically you had this white bread boy here leading a black church funeral unexpectedly for a family that was otherwise unchurched. And I learned some things. I learned some things, and I was exhausted. I was just exhausted at the end for a number of reasons.
Well, that'll teach you to stand at the corner of Forest Lane and Central with a I do.
We'll do funerals for food. I hadn't thought about that. You know.
Get some more.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I even raised this is, you know, we talk a lot about the unchurched in America today, and 23 or 32%? It's about a third of the population claims now to be a religious none. So those are the people who, when you ask them what is their religious affiliation, they check the box, none. And we know that membership in churches is declining. We know that church attendance has been declining for decades. Denominations are dying, and we know all those statistics. But the point is, it's much more complicated than that. Because almost every, I'm going to use air quotes here, unchurched family I've ever dealt with at a funeral is not entirely unchurched. There are still cultural connections, right? Whether it be the heritage of the black church or the heritage of some other evangelical church or some family member. And even in families that appear to be unchurched, there are people within them who are churched. And there's sometimes conflicts between those family members about what's going to happen. And it just will surprise the heck out of you that in our culture today, we think about people who are unchurched, but I think we often think about them entirely wrong. Because we assume they know nothing about religion. And that's often not the case. Other studies have shown that atheists in America are often more knowledgeable of the Bible than evangelical Christians. Now think about that one for a minute. Right? So a lot of our assumptions about culture turn out not to be necessarily valid, but we all get there with our stereotypes of who people are, right? And the other thing is that there are a ton of variations and sects in Christianity that even someone like me who works in this daily doesn't know. My particular experience on Friday was so unique. Some of y'all know Bill Leonard, who's a friend of ours here at Wilshire, church historian, noted person, right? And I sent Bill an email and explained the whole thing to him. There's a particular odd sect that I intersected at this funeral that believes the people of African origin are a lost tribe of Israel.
Wow.
And they are essentially Messianic Jews without being Jews. It's a different way of getting at it. And even Bill, who studies American religion, said, I've never heard of this group, right? And so there's just all sorts of variations out there, and I never cease to be amazed at, you know, all the variations. It's so easy to lump people into categories. But I'm increasingly learning that the categories are more narrow and much more plentiful than it's not just evangelicals versus mainline, or Protestants versus Catholics, or Northerners versus Southerners, or traditionalists versus whatever. You know, those are easy, quick labels, but there are so many subcategories within those that transcend everything. And Bill Leonard has been preaching for 30 years. I mean, I remember the first time I ever heard him say this, that we were entering a post-denominational age in which affinity groups are more important than denominations. And we absolutely see that to be true today, where whatever your affinity is. So I wrote this week about a group called Acts 29. And Acts 29 is a group of Calvinist starting churches. So if any of y'all, some of y'all have told me you've listened to the Christianity Today podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. if you're into that stuff and have 12 hours to listen to a podcast, I do recommend it. Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill Church. Mark was a pastor in Seattle who's now pretty much disgraced. But he was an authoritarian, male chauvinist, very popular pastor because he was hip. But he preached a pretty strict Calvinist theology of male headship and all, but he didn't fit the part of a fundamentalist pastor, right? And so he got all this notoriety. He started this network called Acts 29. And now Matt Chandler, who's pastor of the Village Church here in Dallas, up north of Louisville. Village Church has multiple satellite locations. Some of you remember the old Northway Baptist Church on Walnut Hill. By the way, they got hit by the tornado 2 years ago, that building. So that building is now a campus of Village Church. And Matt Chandler is really, really popular in this young Calvinist, these Reformed pastor things. And he's now head of this network. And this week, they announced that they were offering, this is not a denomination. This is a network of 400 churches. And they are offering $50,000 in funding to pastors who will start new churches to affiliate with their organization. Now, if you're a young church starter, that's a lot of money. That is a lot of money, right? To get over a 2-year period. And they're trying to create churches that are like them, right? But they're not a denomination. And they don't claim to be a denomination. They don't want to be a denomination. All they care about is church starting, but they also have their own doctrinal statement, right? That fits a particular bill. And so what used to happen, and I didn't mean to get off on this discourse, but I hope you'll find some connection here. What used to happen, and Jim Hancock is someone who's worked in this for many, many years. If you're going to start a new church in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even in the 90s, you had a denomination behind it. You had, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, you had Dallas Baptist Association, you had the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and you had a sponsoring church who all four worked together, typically, to start a church. When we started Christ Church in Rockwall some years ago now, that's exactly what happened. Christ Church got funding from us, from the BGCT, from Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and all of those together made this possible, right? But the model we're now seeing in this post-denominational age is that Joe Schmo over here has a calling to be a church planter, and he may go out on his own and begin a church and then assimilate support from various groups, which could include the Southern Baptist Convention, but it also could include Acts 29. It could include other sponsoring churches. And the whole, what we used to call, I love this word, parachurch movement, right, has won. That is the dominant force in American religion today, not denominations, right? And this is changing the scope. Now, some of these folks would say, we are returning to the roots. We are returning to the roots of the way the church ought to be. I'll go ahead and tell you part of my story from the funeral on Friday because it's relevant now. And this will tie into our lesson, I promise. Because I'm going to make it tie in. The brother of the deceased, there was a tribute time when anyone could get up and talk. And yes, it got out of hand, as these things always do. And yes, I finally had to stand up and just sort of take control, as I've had to do before. Some of you all have been at those funerals where this has happened. But the brother of the deceased got up at what I thought was a funeral for an unchurched person, right? and gave an evangelistic appeal worthy of any evangelist I've ever heard, Jim. No, young people, no one knows the hour, no one knows the day. This could be your day. You need to get right with God. I mean, it was the whole thing, and it was eloquent. But I noticed he was wearing around his waist what looked like rosary beads, hanging down like 6 or 8 of them all around his waist. They were probably that long, and they were wooden beads on a strand. And finally, when we got to the cemetery, 2 hours later, when we got to the cemetery, I asked him, I said, well, I'm just curious, because he and some of the other guys, and their wives all had scarves over their heads, and the men all had beards as well, and not trimmed beards. And I said, what's the story behind the beads? And he said, well, they're like the Jewish tassels that the Pharisees would have worn, right? Some of you know this story about there were these long tassels that the religious leaders in ancient Judaism wore on their clothing. And so I said to him, well, are you Messianic Jewish? And he said, no, not really. I would describe us as, and here's the word of the day, pre-Constantinian Christianity. Pre-Constantinian Christianity. So I went and looked up the church afterward, and there's a website, and it's a movement that it is what he said. They act like Messianic Jews in a way, except their belief is that from the time of Constantine, the church got corrupted, which that's a fair assessment in some historical ways, right? From the time of Constantine, the church got corrupted, and they're trying to return to a pre-Constantinian Christianity, but the big but here is their entire system is built upon the belief that people of African continent origin, wherever they may be in the world, are a lost tribe of Israel and represent part of the Jewish tradition. And so their worship and their religious practice are very much like Orthodox Judaism in some ways, but with an evangelical bent to it. Jim is the most fascinating funeral I've ever done.
I think so.
Right? Because again, I walked in thinking this is for an unchurched person. So what you had was the mashup of a cultural black church experience mixed in with this sect that was part of the group that was there, including the praise team they brought, at an otherwise secular funeral where you brought in an unknown white 60-year-old male to be the preacher. And it was quite an experience.
It's like Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, I mean, like a skit, right? And
How did it happen?
I got enlisted by the funeral home.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure all this out. I've spent 2 days trying to figure this out. How all this happens, right? And there's tremendous tragedy and grief involved in this because this is a young woman who's died of breast cancer, right?
What kind of feedback did you get from the people?
Not a lot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's always hard. Doing a pickup funeral is really one of the hardest things I think you can do, right? Because you don't have any relationship with people before or after. And I think what's interesting is I think most of the folks at the service assumed I worked for the funeral home. They didn't understand I was just a random pastor brought in by the funeral home to do this. But as America becomes more and more secular, right, there's two paths happening in the funeral business. There are those who don't want a religious funeral at all and end up having basically some sort of truly secular remembrance, if anything. That's one trend. And then the other trend is those who have enough religious underpinnings in their lives that they know they want a religious service, but they don't have access to the resources to do it. And so it gets pieced together in different ways, and that's how you get a mashup like this. Susan?
Did you meet with the people ahead of time who were the close family to?
I'd had a phone conversation with the mother of the deceased. Typically, I'll call and talk to someone on the phone, and I've written previously about how difficult this usually is. It's not difficult because it's difficult to have a conversation, but what's difficult most of the time is these family members don't have much to say about the deceased. It's very hard, very, very hard to get enough information to do what, I mean, you know the way we do funerals around here, they're customized. And we try to speak about the deceased and so forth, right? But often, I knew more in this case than I did in a lot of times. Well, he was a lovely person. He was a good father. He was a great grandfather. Well, was he involved in any organizations? No. Did he have any hobbies? No. Did he travel? No. He was just a good person. And literally, that is all the family has to say about the deceased. And then I'm left trying to make a funeral sermon out of nothing. Right? Which is how you end up with a generic kind of funeral sermon, the best you can. Like I could write a book about all of these kinds of experiences. I'm sure many pastors could, right? Because a lot of times pastors get called upon to do this.
I have a series of 13 where I kept records of who had conducted funerals. Out of the 13, 11 of them I saw in the casket for the first time. I'd never laid eyes on them before. And one of the other two was my grandmother. So it really should be 11 out of 12.
Right.
Out of 13.
But see, Duane, that's exactly it. And that pattern is only increasing. I had communication during the holidays with a pastor friend in Wilshire, Texas. All right? And the conversation was COVID deaths. And how this conversation started is immaterial at this point. That takes us down a whole other rabbit path that we don't need to go down. In his congregation, I'm trying to remember the numbers. I think he said he had buried, these may be wrong, I think he said he had buried 11 people from his own congregation who died of COVID in Wilshire, Texas, but that he had done 20 other funerals in the community for people who had no church affiliation who died of COVID.
But those are the people that are not vaccinated.
And he did say most of the people were not vaccinated.
And in the small towns, they don't wear masks.
Right. So,
don't.
but here's the other interesting thing. He talked to his colleagues in that association in that area, right? And very few of them had similar experiences. It was very uneven. But now he is the pastor at First Baptist Church. Stacy. Yeah. He was very thoughtful, about this. And like me, he was troubled at trying to understand, the nature of this. But I think even in the midst of COVID, here's another illustration, not from a big city, but from a more rural area. And we assume that rural areas are more churched than urban areas, and that is a wrong assumption. That is a wrong assumption. There may be the cultural trappings of church, but there may not be a relationship with the church there, right? And so the whole point of this is to say, when we think about American religion today, and we think about people who are churched and unchurched, most of what we just naturally go to is probably wrong. We make assumptions about people. We make assumptions about people that I'm finding over and over again are way too simple for their lives. Because even most unchurched people in America today have connections through someone to a church. They just chose. This is why the category of the nun, what is your religious affiliation, nun? Within that demographic group in America today, only 6% of the nation, 3% are atheist, 3% are agnostic. The rest of that number are people who believe. They just don't have an affiliation with the church. That's where we are today.
I can't help but ask this, because to me the bigger question is, where is this country going to be 100 years from now? Are we going to wind up a nation of oath keepers? There's so, outside the cities, there's so much stuff going on that we in large communities just don't understand.
So the question is, where's this nation going to be 20, 30 years or so down the road, 50 years? I want to answer your question not from a political perspective, but from a religious perspective, and I think the two intersect,
Yeah.
right? Because what we also know statistically in America today is that people, this is a weird finding. There are a lot of people in America today who claim to be evangelical Christian who are not Christian. Because to them, that label is a political label now, not a religious label, right? Even though there are truly evangelical Christians who are not political in the same way they are, right? So it's a really mixed bag, the terminology. And I think one of the things I'm most interested about in American religion today is, what are some better labels? What are some better ways of talking about people that don't fall into these easy stereotypes, right? That we so quickly turn to. And I'm one of the people who turns, because every week we're having to report on this group or that group, and we got all these surveys going on. And it's just not a cohesive thing. It is much, much more complicated. And then you add, Texas is a great example. We know in Texas, politically, you have a rural-urban divide. It is very, very strong. You read anything about Texas politics, and you know that the I-35 corridor from Dallas-Fort Worth all the way down to Houston, well, I-35 doesn't actually go to Houston, but it gets thrown in there, right? But go Dallas-Fort Worth, Waco, Austin, San Antonio, then throw in Houston. Politically, that whole strip is blue. Look at the rest of the state, it's red. So politically, there's a divide. Religiously, there are also divides in religious experience that follow that, but don't necessarily mirror the political side of it, right? And in both places, you have mixes of everything. 10, 12, however many years ago, the reason our church start in Rockwall couldn't get enough footing to survive is that we were trying to do a Wilshire style church in Rockwall County, which is one of the most socially and politically conservative counties in the state of Texas. It didn't work. Yes, there were people there who wanted to be part of that, but there weren't enough. Plus, you have behemoth competition in Lake Point Church that dominates that scene in Rockwall, right? So, again, 60+% of Americans who go to church go to a mega church. but 80% or more of the churches in America have fewer than 200 people on Sunday.
I'm just curious, you all were talking about not Christians and, you know, non-choice. They don't
Right.
have a choice.
Yeah, the nuns.
Have we reached the point where we're so evangelically impoverished that we're not reaching out and touching people and telling them?
So Carol Ann's asking, have we reached a point, that's a great language, are we so impoverished that we're not reaching out people and telling them? No. I think there's plenty of evangelism going on. It's that people don't want to hear it, right? Just don't want to hear it. And for sometimes good reasons, right? Sometimes for very good reasons, because they've been burned in different ways. But it is a self-defeating cycle. I was having a conversation, I had coffee with someone this week who attends a church that is even more of a boutique church. I call Wilshire a boutique church. Sometimes you've heard me say, I'll ask people sometimes, if your church were a store at the mall, what store would it be? And are you Sears? Are you like running a sale? I mean, are you Macy's? Are you running a sale every other week just to get people in the door? Are you Neiman's? And you're so selective, you just got, are you the Great American Cookie Factory? Down on the main level, right? Maybe you're Sharper Image, and you're just got all the hip stuff going on, right? I often have likened Wilshire to Nordstrom. And the reason I say that is we've got high standards, we do things well, but we're not so snooty that not anyone can just walk in, right? I once was doing a seminar, and this woman raised her hand in the back of the room, and she said, I think my church is not even in the mall. My church is one of those shops on the outskirts of the mall in the little strip outside the parking lot. Right? And it just takes all kinds is the other thing, right? So to your point, it takes a mall full of churches to do this, and we shouldn't all be the same, because First Baptist Wilshire can reach people we could never reach here in Dallas, right? And we can reach people they never could reach. But I was having coffee with a friend this week who attends a truly boutique church that largely is filled with people who've been burned in other churches and are seeking healing there. And it's a wonderful ministry they have, but it's also, Carol Ann, not one geared toward evangelism, because it's all about bandaging up the wounded. And while there is a place for that, there's also got to be a place for the evangelistic church that's out bringing in people. It takes all of us, right? It takes all of us doing this in an ideal world.
Well, and this is a Charlene comment, not off the iPad, but many malls are falling apart. That a friend of mine who lives in Ohio talked about the east side of Cleveland, which used to be your Highland Park of the Cleveland area. And she said there isn't a decent mall over there. They're all going different ways, or to the outside malls
Right.
as opposed to the inside. So there's something in that too.
Yeah, so the death of the church in America is also related to the death of the shopping mall in America. These two things, there's a parallel track there, right?
And North Park keeps us from seeing that.
Yeah, North Park is the most successful mall in America. It is the most profitable shopping mall per square foot.
Is that right?
Of any shopping mall in America.
Wow. Tomorrow, today will be my third day in a row
See? Right? So it's easy, but again, what happened to Valley View? It's rubble now, right? I'm amazed the Galleria is still going as strong as it is.
They're changing all that. They're turning it into the Dallas International District.
Yes, big
Buying
change.
It's going to be multi-use. So living and shopping and
Yeah.
parks and all sorts of stuff.
So that kind of transformation is also what we're seeing happening in a lot of churches or in the larger church culture as churches try to adapt to this. And man, I didn't mean to get off on however long this has been. Oh my God, we've been talking about this for 30 minutes. This is supposed to be a 5-minute conversation.
That's okay.
Do you know what? It's been good, and just keep going, and we'll get to
2 Thessalonians.
chapter 3 next week.
So why do I tell you all this story to begin with? Several reasons. One, I want you to know that even someone like me who works in the world of religion and interpreting it every day is often flummoxed by what I see. There are no easy answers to understand religion in America today or religion in the world. Second, it's easy for us to get insulated in our own bubble and think everything is the way we see it. And you know, we have this wonderful experience when we come to church here. Not everyone has that. And also, not everyone wants it, right? So we were at Yvonne Bullock's funeral yesterday in the sanctuary, and dear saint, lovely dear saint of ours. Yvonne was 88, and there was a diverse crowd of people there who'd known her and her family through the years. And Allison and I were sitting almost to the back of the sanctuary. And of course, you know, we've reinstated our mask policy here, and there's signs on the door. And as we were coming in, there were people, non-church members, some former church members among them, who didn't have a mask with them and had to go back to the car and find one because they were shocked at our policy. And there were these two grumpy old men, I don't know who they were, sitting behind me, who disrespectfully talked through most of the service to each other. But their conversation began with, well, I haven't worn a mask in a year anywhere. And I'm like, okay, well, you just told me a lot about you in that, if that's the case. And they were grumbling about having to, be in church wearing a mask. I wanted to turn around and grumble about them talking all the time, through the service. But that also goes to another part of this, is that people don't know how to behave in church. And one of the interesting cases that can be made about children is that children who grow up in church generally learn how to behave better in groups because they get weekly experience doing it, right? Versus kids who have no experience being in a place like that other than school, which is different.
And they run all over stores.
And that too, right? So there's an interconnectedness to the change facing the church, to the whole change facing American culture, and it is so diverse. We know that as America grows more unreligious, it is also growing more strictly religious. These two things are happening at the same time, so that you have more and more people who are unaffiliated from a church, and you have more and more people who are affiliated with a strict version of church, right? So this is why fundamentalist Christianity has continued to grow at the same time that the unaffiliated have grown. And if you find yourself in the middle of that, in neither of those places, like most of us do, you're going to sometimes feel like you're all alone in American culture today. This is not where things are, right?
Are we so diverse we're ungovernable?
Are we so diverse we're ungovernable? Well, the root of all that, Anne, is the American insistence on individualism. We are the most individualistic nation in the world. It's been bred into us from the beginning, and it has now reached sick proportions among us. And that affects politics, culture, school, and church, and the workplace as well. People with their idea of individualism. Our daughter-in-law is a physical therapist and recently left working at UT Southwestern to go work with dogs who don't talk back.
How's that going?
Oh, she loves it. Yeah, she absolutely loves it. But she's at our house this weekend with Luke, and we were talking about this yesterday. And she was telling us stories about patients who were, on the COVID unit at UT Southwestern on 30 liters of oxygen. And for those of you who know anything, that's a lot of oxygen, right? Who thought they knew better than the medical personnel. They needed to get up and go to the bathroom. Rather than calling for help, they just took the oxygen mask off, walked over to the bathroom, and then felt faint. Right? And they're like, oh, I know what I can do. Right? And this is what we're suffering through in America because all of us think we know what we can do. And where does the church fit into this? There was a time when the church brought some sense of cohesion to helping people think in groups rather than to think only of themselves, which, by the way, was a point we were going to get to in the lesson today. They'll have to wait till next week because what the church at Thessalonica, what Paul's encouraging them in, is to stand strong together. To stand strong together. And not just in their local unit, but as a body. Well, this has been an odd little journey through American religion today. Again, completely unscripted. I apologize for getting completely off script. I hope you found something interesting in this. Ann?
Well, a funny funeral story that Bruce McKeever, our former pastor, always told was he did a pickup funeral, and the only thing that family could tell him about the person was he was state domino champion.
Bruce did a funeral for someone who was a state domino champion. That was his claim to fame. But, and there are days I could take that, I can make a whole funeral sermon out of that. Because I've gotten good enough at this that you give me one interesting fact and we'll bend it. I once did a funeral for a guy, the only thing they could tell me, the only thing that really stood out was that he drove a bread truck. And I did a whole funeral sermon on Jesus as the bread of life. So y'all, please lead more interesting lives. Caroline?
If we do lead more interesting lives, we have to make sure other people know about it. So when we're gone, they can tell you.
Yeah, this is one of the things I loved about Yvonne Bullock's service yesterday. George did a lovely job.
The note cards, the notes.
Oh, and then they had note cards in that you could.
Well, no, that he held up, he had written.
Oh, yes, because Yvonne wrote cards to people all the time. And so.
I don't remember who it was.
Yeah, it's one of our members. Her name escapes me for a moment. Anyhow, I can see her face. Had saved all of them. And George brought a stack.
Just a few.
Just some of them. It was that thick. Of notes that Yvonne had written to her through the years, encouraging her and so forth. All out of Charlie's Angels class here at Wilshire. But here's someone who was a very quiet, unassuming woman, not a large physical presence, not a large vocal presence, but had a tremendous influence on people that was able to come through, and it was persistence over time, right? Persistence, and just befriending people. And yeah, so there's more to it than being famous. Don't hear me say that you need to go get notoriety. You don't need to go get on TV for this. Oh my God, so
Well,
sorry.
I'm signing up for that pole dancing class, I can tell you.
All right, on that note, we're going to end. Let me say a prayer for us. And oh my gosh, yeah. I promise we'll get back to 2 Thessalonians next week.
No, 3 Thessalonians, isn't it? Aren't we in 3 now?
2 Thessalonians chapter 3.
Chapter 3, okay.
Yeah, chapter
I'll get
3.
it.
Okay. And then we have several other prayer concerns to share here with the group as well. Lord, thank you for our time together today, and we pray that you would help us to continue to find our place in your world, to be your voice and to be your presence in a world that needs to hear your message of good news and hope. We pray for each one among us who is facing their own challenges today, whether medical or spiritual or emotional, relational, so many ways that we can be in distress. And we pray for your peace and your presence to be upon each one, and bless us now, we pray, as we leave here, through Jesus Christ. Amen.
With a Von Bullock